So this is the third, as Tarina said, this is the third of our sessions on Lenin and Leninism, and it follows completely logically from the last two. So we started off with Shabir thinking about imperialism, Lenin's working imperialism, how that shapes the present world. We then had Holly talking about the state and can we reform the state, how Lenin's views on the state as an institutional role as revolutionaries to smash the state and replace it with something much better. And then the logical consequence of that, I think, of those two sort of feeds into what we're going to talk about this morning, which is that we've won the argument last week for the need for revolution. Well, what kind of organisation do we need to help us get to that stage in history? So let me just start off with a couple of perhaps obvious but general points. The first thing is that when we're talking about Lenin, we shouldn't fall into the trap of just assuming that Lenin was the first to talk about parties. All socialists have talked about the need for socialists to group together, to form themselves into networks and organisations to challenge the power of capital, whether that was Marx or whether in Lenin's time the breadths of the Social Democratic Party in Germany. What was distinctive about Lenin is not that he's arguing for a party, wasn't the first to do that, but what is distinctive is about his role in arguing for the need for a distinctly revolutionary party, as opposed to a party of a broad type for socialists. And really that was quite unusual. We need to put that a little bit in its context. You know, if we think about when Lenin was writing at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, most people who considered themselves to be socialists at that time would have looked towards the German Social Democratic Party as the ideal type of organisation. It was a massive organisation. It was in the heart of Germany, one of the leading capitalist powers at that point. It had all sorts of organisations connected to it, so cultural clubs, drama clubs, sports clubs. It was sometimes described as being almost a state within a state, which is not a really very accurate way of describing it, but nevertheless it gives that notion of the breadth of the organisation, its links with the trade unions, the scale of and the weight of the organisation in German society. And yet at that point, Lenin starts to argue for a different type of organisation. And I think the reason for that is to try and get to the heart of two apparently contradictory things that are in Marx himself. So Marx obviously talks about the revolution being the act of the working class itself. So central to Marxism is the notion of the self-emancipation of the working class. So on the one hand, you've got that. And then Marx also said that the ruling ideas of the epoch are the ideas of the ruling class. So you've also got that set of ideas as well. And if you think about that for a minute, those two things are a bit contradictory, or they seem contradictory. How can you have the self-emancipation of the working class when the majority of ideas that dominate in society are the ideas of the ruling class? Well, surely you're never going to manage to marry those two things up. And what we start to see within Lenin is the argument that what you need to do is understand the unevenness of consciousness within the working class and organise the revolutionary minority within that. And you organise the revolutionary minority to organise in the class, to build the revolutionary organisations and to give us a better chance of winning in struggles and winning the ultimate struggle itself. To understand that, I think we need to just grasp one other thing, and that I think is probably best explained not so much in Lenin, but in Gramsci, when Gramsci talked about contradictory consciousness. And I think there's two things that I would take from that. First of all, that it's possible for people to have conflicting ideas in their head at one time. Capitalism itself is very contradictory. We have lots of sort of mixed ideas in our head, and in that sort of mix, there are those who come to revolutionary conclusions, and that's who you want to organise into your revolutionary party. There are some who take the most backward reactionary conclusions and are wedded to that way of the world. So they are racist, they are fascist, they are on the far right, they are scabs, they are utter reactionaries, and that's who they are. But for the majority of people, they have a sort of mix of ideas in their head at any one time, and they will move back and forward into action. Sometimes they will agree with the right wing, and sometimes they can agree with us. And it's in that centre, that's who we're trying to organise to try and win that centre over to towards our background, our ideas. And from Lenin's point of view, the best way to do that is to make sure that you have got an organisation of revolutionaries who will act in unity and act decisively to try and put their arguments forward, to engage in practice, and to try and win people over to that particular perspective. So I want to try and look at some of those ideas, and I want to look particularly through the works of Lenin, and we'll talk a little bit about his work, what is to be done. But in the last couple of weeks, when Shabir's talked about imperialism, and when Holly's talked about state and revolution, I suppose one of the things would be to go away and read Lenin's Imperialism or read State and Revolution. At the end of this, I think it would be really good if people did go away and read what is to be done. I'm not saying don't do that, but I also think that when it comes to thinking about Lenin and his writing on the party, we also have to understand that it was very historically contingent. So there are some things in what is to be done that that Lenin himself moved away from, even within a couple of years of writing that, because he was constantly thinking about that question, what is to be done, and what party forms are best, and how do we relate to people when they form the struggle, what strategies and tactics do we need to adapt and take forward. And so I'm sure you've come across some far left groups, but they almost take what is to be done as a sort of Bible, and it's a dogma, and party organisation must follow exactly what Lenin said and what is to be done. And that would be a huge mistake. So, of course, hopefully at the end of this, people will go away and read what is to be done, but there's much more to be said in Lenin himself and in the Marxist tradition about how party develops and what forms those things should take. Okay, bit of a long introduction, thrown a little bit by me being kicked off the system, but here we go. So I want to start off then by thinking about capitalism itself and the contradictory nature of capitalism, and how that shapes the two types of parties that you can have, so the broad party and the revolutionary party. And if we think about the broad party, let's just try and think about that in terms of the Labour Party in Britain itself, and we try and contrast that with the revolutionary party. So capitalism itself is a system that's full of contradictions. And the way in which that works in capitalism, it doesn't mean that experience will automatically solve that for us in progressive ways. Let me give you an example. If you are in workplace and they are talking about redundancies, the correct reason to understand that is because of the nature of capitalism, the profit motive, the way that capitalism puts profit before all else, that redundancies are part of their process of trying to increase extraction of surplus value, etc., etc., etc. So that is the cause of unemployment in most general terms. But if you are the person that's facing unemployment, and there is somebody in your workplace that argues that unemployment is caused by too much immigration, there is nothing that directly in your experience that will contrast that. That can make sense. It's not a right answer, but it can make sense, and it can motivate action in that way. So the contradictions of capitalism throw up all those conflicts in that way. So how do we, as revolutionaries, respond to that? Obviously, you take the principled position, you argue against the revolutionaries, but there is a sense in which, if you're thinking of political organisation, do you bend to the dominant ideas of society, or do you take that principled position? So if you're organising on a very broad basis, something like the Labour Party, and you're confronted with those ideas, it's not impossible for people in the Labour Party to say unemployment is bad, we don't agree with racism, but it certainly is the case that there's too much migration. We have to have immigration controls in some point of way. The broad party, like the Labour Party or the Social Democratic parties, bend to the dominant ideas by trying to create a milieu basically around voting that will try to represent the entire class in its contradictions. So that means that if you think about the Labour Party, you can have some people who are for immigration controls and some people who are against immigration controls. You can have some people who are for Palestinian rights, and you can have some people who are pro-Zionist. You can have some people who are against imperialist war and those who are advocates of imperialist war, because the basis of trying to recruit people to your organisation is to be as broad as possible, to bend to bourgeois ideology in that process, to try and build electoral alliances, to try and make your party as big as possible. In contrast, what Lenin argued for was the organisation of the revolutionary minority. Understanding that you would be a minority, at least a minority this side of the revolution, but you would be a minority of people committed to the view of the need for revolutionary change. And from that, unlike the Broad Party, it was a way of forging a smaller party around core ideas, and then moving that party to act in a way where it acted together collectively, and we'll come back to that in a minute, that acts decisively, that is prepared to take risks when it takes those actions, with a view that decisive acting together can have an impact in the struggles which are taking place in the here and now. So in What Is to Be Done, Lenin starts to argue that these things are best understood by thinking about the Revolutionary Party as being a party of professional revolutionaries. So he argues for the party to be professional revolutionaries. And in fact, in What Is to Be Done, he says in the autocratic state of Russia that he's talking about, that we should confine membership. This was based on his argument at that point, that the revolutionaries should be immersed in revolutionary theory, convinced revolutionaries, dedicating their life to the revolution, joining the party, and prepared to give that level of sacrifice to work across Russia to try and develop struggles from there. And what is to be done, he also says that that's because we have to bring revolutionary theory to the working class. And he says that working class consciousness and the struggles that working class people were involved in Russia at that time can only ever lead to a trade union consciousness. And it's the job of the party, the job of the revolutionaries, to bring revolutionary consciousness to the class. And he also says that that spontaneity cannot be fully revolutionary. It just leads to a trade union consciousness. So if you were to take only those things from What Is to Be Done, you would have a view of a revolutionary party as a minority within the class, a group of people who are professional revolutionaries, full-time professional revolutionaries, who are the font of revolutionary theory, and would then bring that to the working class from outside and try to shape the struggles that are taking place, which in and of themselves can only be spontaneous, can only lead to trade union consciousness. From that argument, he then goes on to set out the kind of forms that the party should take, so the organisational forms that flow from that. And for Lenin, that was the construction of the party around the notion of democratic centralism. And democratic centralism is both democratic and centralist. So the democratic part is that all the party members are involved in the discussions that take place. They are free to air their views in whatever way and shape that they take. But at the point in which the party comes to a conclusion, there is a vote is taken. That is the democratic part. And then there's the central part, which is that we then agree to implement that collectively. So if you were to take that in the present, if there was an election for a general secretary in one of the main unions, and there was division amongst Counterfire members over who we should support, should we support Chris Nynam or Tarina Hine for the post of Unite General Secretary? We have that debate. We decide that we're voting for neither of them, and instead we're going to vote for somebody else. If that wins, at that point, despite the fact that some argued for Tirina, despite the fact that some voted for Chris, we have taken a democratic decision and they've all decided that Eunice is the ideal member to lead Unite, and that's who we vote for. And then in our activity, in the unions, in our communities, that's the argument we put forward. So democratic centralism. So why that? So first of all, I think it's a recognition, in contrast to the broad party of what the Revolutionary Party it does. Of course, as a revolutionary party, we are opposed to everything about the very nature of capitalism. But if we spread our tentacles and we're involved in absolutely everything all the time, then we won't be focused enough in the key arguments that are taking place. So again, let me draw the contrast. If you think about the Labour Party, I haven't been in the Labour Party for 40 years, but you know, in the Labour Party, you can be in the Labour Party women's section, you can be in the Labour Party black section, you can be in the Labour Party interest group around Palestine, you can be in the Labour Party interest group around X, Y, or Z. And for many people, the X, Y, or Z will be what they put most of their efforts into, you know, the cooperative movement or this or that. And what you do is that you can dissipate your energies. So one of the things that the Revolutionary Party is, of course, we are opposed to the Israeli occupation of Palestine, we're opposed to imperialism, we're opposed to racism and sexism and homophobia and all those things. And as revolutionaries, we have perspectives on each and every one of them. But we also have to make decisions about what is the key political activity at this point in time and how best can we put our efforts as a small organisation together to have the biggest impact on that key political issue at that point. So rather than us all going off and voting in all different ways, we have the debate, we come to the conclusion at a meeting or a conference, and from that point, we then act in unity together around those, whatever decision we've come to vote for Eunice for Unite General Secretary, or to decide that we should throw all our efforts into the anti-war movement, or to decide that actually there's a real problem of fascism, and so we've got to build a united front around fascism here, or it's about actually it's the trade union movement is the key issue just now, and so we've got to throw ourselves into strikes and strike support activity. Whatever the key action is, we move together, we have the debate, we come to that decision, and then that's how we move forward together. So it's not an organisation of broad interests, it's an organisation trying to find that key link, that key issue, and acting together. And it's a democratic centralism, those ways of debating and come to those conclusions that operate in that way. So democratic centralism is very important in terms of the internal party discussions, in terms of leadership, in terms of how we push those things together. Okay, so what that means then, I think, is that from Lenin, what we get is that organisational form flows directly from the tasks that we face us, that democratic centralism is a key mechanism of how we work. And from reading what's to be done, you might think then that it's a minority organisation of professional revolutionaries. We should be embedded in Marxist theory. And in fact, some revolutionary organisations are so committed to this notion that before you can even join, you've got to take an exam in Marxist theory to get in. I'm sure that would be, you know, very welcoming to any 18-year-old in Britain who's just been through SATs tests and A-levels and O-levels and the most tested people in the world. Now you've got to have an exam before you can join Counterfire. If you were only to look at what's to be done, you can see how some people have drawn those conclusions. The problem that you have is that Lenin wrote what is to be done in 1902. By 1905, Lenin's arguing against people in the Communist Party or the Bolshevik Party at the time, against their views, and arguing that what you've got to do is open the doors of the party, that the party's too small. We shouldn't think about ourselves as just being an organisation of professional revolutionaries or committee men. We've got to, in a place like Petrograd, we should have 5,000, 10,000 members of the party. We shouldn't have exams to enter. If you're committed to the struggle, if you think there's need for a better world, you should be joining the organisation in that way. And so it seems that very, very quickly, Lenin has bent the stick. He's thrown the door of the party opening, and he's arguing against people in the Bolshevik party who are saying, well, you were saying that we had to be immersed in theory. You were saying that we had to be committee men. You were saying that we had to be full-time revolutionaries. The situation had changed. And so Lenin argues for a different orientation to that in the time when the struggle deepens in that way. So throughout of Lenin's writings, there is that constant change and constant engagement, and the change comes from the outside world. It comes from the situation he faces himself in, and the Bolsheviks face themselves in, and it's about making the decisions about which way the party should go at that time. It's not a set of dogmas about in what is to be done. Lenin said this is what we always have to do from there on in. So if you take what is to be done, but you also take Lenin's writings in the party over the time, I think there's a number of things that we can draw out that are central to what Lenin means by the party and how it operates. So the first thing is that I think we can say that within Lenin's commitment to Marxist theory and theory is essential. Theory in a number of ways. So first of all, that means that, because Marxism is a living science, and within the party, we must look reality in the face. We must try to understand the world and its developments. We can't, the world has moved on since Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. We have to understand the contemporary world and all its mess, and we use Marx in that way as a science to understand the world. Also, theory because the Revolutionary Party should be the memory of the class. One of the key things about us is that we want to get people to read history, to understand the great struggles of the past, what happened in the Russian Revolution, what happened in the Spanish Civil War, what's a history of trade unionism in Britain. Why? It's not because we've got a fetish of history. It is because we want to understand the past, to make sure that we understand the lessons of the past, so that when we are faced with similar issues in the present, we can draw on that tradition, what's sometimes called the repertoire of contention, the things that we've done that have been successful in the past, and apply them to the new situation. So theory is important to the revolutionary organisation, both in terms of Marxist theory and history, and understanding our history and where we've come from. But practice is superior. So what I mean by that is that if you just took the first part, the right thing to do is just go away and read history books and read Marx and read Capital and not throw ourselves into the struggle. But the reality is, in the struggle, people can move very, very quickly, and they educate themselves, they have a better understanding of the world, they bring new initiatives into the struggle itself. So for Lenin, theory is essential, but practice is superior. We have to throw ourselves into the real world, and the purpose of the theory, the purpose of the history reading, the purpose of the studying of Marx and of the party and all those things is to make our practice in the struggles superior and better, and to deepen that struggle in that way. The second thing I think you get from Lenin and his work in the party is that the truth is always concrete. What I mean by that is that you have to be against hyperbole. There's no point in the party saying that all we need to do is one last strike and this will win, or if you're in UCU at the present time, we just need 2 more universities out on an ASOS boycott, or 3 more universities to come out on strike, and at that point we will definitely win. There's no point in exaggerating. You have to look reality in the face, you have to deal with difficult questions, and you have to tell the truth as it is. But you shouldn't be miserableist. You shouldn't also be in the position of saying there's nothing we can do, because there's always things that we can do. But you don't exaggerate, you're not miserableist. It's about assessing the situation, and the truth is always concrete, so telling reality as it is. The third thing I think you get from Lenin is that the struggle is always uneven. Whether that's the historic struggle, whether that's a struggle in around a strike, whether that's the unevenness around the anti-war movement, it's always uneven, and it's about how we relate to that. And the point for us is to try and grab the key link, to get the key link in the political process. In doing that, this is where democratic centralism, I think, it can be very important, because you know, if I'm in Liverpool and somebody else is in London and Mark's in Glasgow, I'm just trying to look who's on there. So Sissy's in London, I'm in Liverpool, Mark's in Glasgow, Tony's in Newcastle. We might all be throwing ourselves into the struggle around a rent struggle or a strike or whatever. But that could be uneven. So in Liverpool, my report might be, I don't think this is taken off. There's not many people out. But in Newcastle, Tony might be saying, everybody's out. This is the greatest strike since the 1968 Paris barricades. And in Glasgow, so the localities, you can misread the situation. That's why it's important that we have a national structure where we take and synthesize the experience across the whole country and come to an evaluation of where we actually are and what the key elements are, what the key moments in the struggle are. So, you know, the local is key, because we have to feed in what's happening in Glasgow and Liverpool and Newcastle and London. And then together we have that overall picture. And sometimes the central parts of the organisation who have that overview are best placed to take those decisions. And when it comes to taking those decisions, although the party rules might say that we have an annual conference, and each December we meet up, and in December we will take the decisions about what we will do over the next 12 months. But if that struggle happens in February, you don't wait till the next December. It's the democratically elected leadership of the organisation who has that overview, who says, actually, although we said this just a few months ago, the situation has changed. We have to change dramatically and decisively to throw ourselves into this struggle at this point in time, because that's what's happening at this point. So the truth is always concrete. Reality in the struggle can be uneven. And that's why we have a revolutionary organisation which is built around those democratic centralist structures, which allows us quickly to act decisively when new issues come into the fore. The fourth thing I think you get is that organisation is historically determined. So that's just my point about what is to be done. You can find, you know, if you're out in paper sales in some places, certainly in Liverpool, which seems to have every brand of far left organisation, and you will find some whose nature of organisation is built on what is to be done of 1902, and you have to have an exam to get in, and then you have this full-time revolution, and this is your commitment and whatever. But what is to be done is a centrally important part of our historical repertoire. We should all go away and read it, but it is not a dogma. And Lenin himself moved away from that in the 1905 revolution in the example that I gave. So the specifics of the organisational forms, whether we have branches in every town or city, whether we break that down and have factory branches because there's a huge upturn in the industrial struggle, whether we have branches that are based on communities because there's a rent strike or there's something going on around the poll tax, those things will be determined by the struggle itself and what is the best means for the party to operate, to grow, to engage in the struggle at that point in time. But at the present time, we wouldn't have industrial branches, but in another period in time, we might have industrial branches. At the present time, we don't have community networks around rent strikes, but in another point in time, we might do that. So there's not a one-size-fits-all, and the shape and form that the party takes will change depending on the nature of the struggle itself. The final thing there is that Lenin also says that party rules are important. A bit more controversial one here, but there shouldn't be too many of them, because the problem is if you have too many party rules, we become embedded in bureaucracy, and we're not a party for the sake of being a party. We're a party for the sake of being an active agent in the struggle for a better world. So of course there's basic party rules, but sometimes those party rules will be broken, and sometimes those rules will be out of place. The key thing is that we are a combat organisation, voluntarily groups of people coming together with a view that we are going to engage in the struggle and shape the world, and that those bureaucratic things should not determine the party in any set way. And in fact, Lenin said throughout his time that at key points, you know, if you think about in the Russian Revolution and the early part of 1917, the problem was that too many long-standing Bolsheviks were immersed in the rules, and Lenin was having to argue against them, arguing that they were a brake on the struggle that was taking place in 1917 itself. So what I think you get then in Lenin is the two things. First of all, that Marxism, of course, as I said, it was a science, and that it is a science of an understanding of the problems of the world, of the shape of the world, of the dynamics of capitalism and how we understand it. But in Lenin, we also see that Marxism is an art. It's an art of political process, and it is an art of how we take from the past, we develop the skills, we develop the experience to be able to act and respond to situations, and to be able to act quickly, even if it means quite sharp turns in direction. The Revolutionary Party has to do that. It has to focus on what the key link in any particular chain is. It has to grasp the key area or arena of the struggle at the present, and that's where we put all our energies in. We don't dissipate our energies around a whole host of activities, but we have to find that focus, that key link that can allow us as a minority to start to influence the networks and the communities and the organisations that are involved in struggle, to try and win them to revolutionary politics and revolutionary ideas, and to try and pull people closer to us in that struggle. The final thing is that Lenin's notion, I think, of the party therefore is a very dynamic one. It's one that shifts and changes with that focus on how we deepen our connection with the masses. But it also, I think, opens up how other forms of working, that we have a very sharp ideological intervention into all struggles that are taking place. But of course, we do that at the same time that in practice we will unite with others who do not share that common ideological stance. And in many ways, that means that the sort of common tactic is the tactic of the United Front. And when we go into the United Front, we work together to build the campaigns as broadly as possible: Stop the War, People's Assembly, anti-racist movements, movements to defend a women's right to choose, and the trade unions, whatever the United Front is, we're involved building that. We want to be the best people at building those campaigns, trying to make it as big and as dynamic as possible. But within that, we have our own clear ideological stance, because we want to make the case that we have a deeper, richer understanding and can pull people towards us in that way. But that also leads to one danger that we've always got to be. It's a very fine line to draw between, on the one hand, working together in solidarity to build those movements, to have your own ideological standpoints as the Revolutionary Party, an organisation trying to win people towards your politics, but to try and balance both of those without ever being sectarian, without denouncing people because they don't agree with you or whatever. So you don't want to be sectarian at all. We've got to work fraternally, friendly with people, but we do have to have the clear ideological divisions between us and those who are who will be fighting alongside as well. So I think unlike I think I started off, unlike the previous two meetings that we've had on Lenin, the one on Lenin the party, I think, is obviously vitally important, because we are Leninists, we are in a Leninist organisation. It is important for us to understand our own history and where we came from. But the problem is that you can find a quote from Lenin about all manner of organisational forms of what the party takes. So it's not so much about Lenin's words per se, but it's about learning about his practice and the adaptability of his practice, and the way in which the party itself adapts to the historical circumstances in which it finds itself. So the revolutionary organisation, to finish up then, must be that. It must be a tight-knit organisation of revolutionaries who are internally open to debate, democratic argument and all the rest of it, but who, when they come to decisions, act upon those in a unified way. That we act in a unified way around what we think the key issues in any particular movement are. That at each point we're trying to grasp the key issue. There are many issues out there, but we're trying to grab the key issue because we think that we have something important to say, but also that gives us the biggest chance of trying to move the movement forward. But we also don't have a fetish about our particular form, what we will look like in terms of our political organisation. And as the world changes, how Counterfire is organised will change as well. It will be, there will be a point at some point in the future where Counterfire will have factory and office branches, but that's not today. There will be a point when we do have branches on every community estate across the country, but that's not where we're at today. And neither of those two things are necessarily always goals. The point I'm making is that depending on what is happening in the outside world, our organisational form will adapt to best reflect our intervention in that changing world. And for me, that's what I get from Lenin and Lenin's notion of the party.